Hello folks, Nintendo recently released the Switch 2 edition of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, which both upgrades the original game's content in some subtle ways and adds the Bellabel Park expansion with all its various minigame and boss fight activities. And having now played through everything this upgrade has to offer, today I'm going to give my opinions on its more noteworthy additions. Also, since I've made a number of videos about the problems I had with the original game, I thought an interesting way of going about this would be to go through some of those problems again and see if and how they have been addressed. Oh, and of course, this means I'll be spoiling everything in the upgrade. Alright, so as I briefly mentioned in my original Wonder Switch 2 Edition predictions video, one of my biggest issues with the original game that I also heard other people complain about time and time again was its boss fights. Although I don't think the Bowser Jr. encounters or the final Bowser fight are poorly designed or anything, not only are they maybe not quite imaginative enough to match the rest of the game's wondrous theming, but also obviously the fact that there are only 5 boss fights, 4 of which are variations of the same one, across a game with 9 or so worlds is kinda crazy. Between Shining Falls, Fungi Mines, and all the airship levels, there are quite a few places throughout the original game where it feels like a boss encounter should have taken place, and without one these parts feel anticlimactic. And it seems like with the benefit of hindsight, the game's developers felt the same way, since one of the big additions of the Switch 2 upgrade is 7 new Koopaling boss fights. And in bringing them back for this DLC, not only did the designers completely avoid the repetitiveness that previously plagued the Koopalings in the new Super Mario Bros. Games, but I honestly think these are some of the best boss fights in any 2D Mario game. Instead of focusing on some kind of simple accessory or gimmick, each Koopaling fight features a completely unique and often pretty crazy looking transformation. And whereas before Koopaling fights always stuck to the same 3-hit structure, broken up by these basic shell attack phases, the new iterations take a larger number of hits to defeat and feature way more varied waves of attacks. In general, the depth and scale of these bosses' obstacles and gimmicks go above and beyond those seen in almost any fight in previous Mario side-scrollers. If anything, some aspects of these fights remind me of the type of design seen in games known for their intricate boss encounters. Lemmy takes like a dozen hits during his final phase and will do a secondary attack if you don't damage him quickly enough. Morton requires you to take advantage of the shockwave caused by his slam attack to jump up high enough to be able to damage him, and Ludwig covers half the screen in rotating lightning beams during his final phase. I never thought I'd see anything like this in a Mario game, but I'm glad the designers put the time and resources into making sure each of these fights are unique and memorable. Though that's not to say they're perfect. I think the way Wendy doesn't do anything except charge or jump at the player feels a bit simplistic, Lemmy's bouncy bombs aren't super intuitive, having to navigate Larry's randomized crystal block maze off-screen is kinda finicky, I don't like the way Roy's fight just allows you to damage him constantly, Iggy's bouncy piranha plant things aren't the most intuitive mechanic either, the entire gimmick of Morton's fight can be circumvented using the flower suit, and I don't like how Ludwig's fight forces you to wait for these rainy clouds to activate. But those are mostly nitpicks. Overall, these showdowns are really enjoyable and several steps above those in the original game. Though speaking of which, I do think the choice to integrate the fights into Wonder's existing world structure while simultaneously making it a part of a separate storyline is a bit questionable. Obviously, the way the Toad Brigade tents are scattered across the game's worlds encourages players to face off against the Koopalings whilst playing through the main campaign, but I wish the developers had had the guts to take this a step further and fully integrate them into the original game's levels. Although I like how they allow you to play with some of the upcoming bosses' mechanics before they become more relevant, for the most part the transformed level segments that precede the Koopaling encounters aren't anything to write home about, and as should be pretty clear to anyone who watched my initial playthrough video, with the way the Koopaling campaign is treated as its own self-contained story, to me Ludwig being the final boss with no kind of additional fight against all the Koopalings at once doesn't feel like a proper conclusion. So even though this maybe would have been a bit of a nightmare to implement in terms of logistics, I think ditching the whole Toad Brigade integration and instead putting the Koopaling fights at the end of the original game's anticlimactic final levels would have made them an even more transformative addition. But alright, that's mostly everything I wanted to say about the Koopalings, so let's move on to something else. One of my major requests in the aforementioned Super Mario Bros. Wonder Switch 2 Edition predictions video was some kind of hard mode, which I thought could maybe be implemented through the game's badge system. This would be a way of fixing the original game's lack of difficulty without needing to drastically transform its level design. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, they didn't add a hard mode in the actual Switch 2 edition, but although that's technically true, I think the Toad Brigade training mission things pretty much serve the same purpose. In case you're not aware, these levels are a lot like the ones in New Super Mario Bros. U's challenge mode. They require you to do something along the lines of collecting coins, defeating enemies, or just clearing the level, usually before a timer runs out. On the surface, that doesn't sound particularly thrilling, and indeed some of these missions are not only very simplistic, but also very easy, but most of the more unique and difficult challenges are both really fun to play and really well designed, I think. It may be a simple idea, but the mode where you can't touch any of the enemies, or sometimes coins, in a part of a pre-existing level leads to some very unique platforming puzzles. The inclusion of more difficult boss refights is fun, and I particularly loved the versions of these that require you to defeat the Koopalings without any kind of power-up, since this prevents you from being able to cheese anything. I also really like the challenges that force you to use a certain badge, since as someone who honestly never uses badges whilst playing the original game's normal levels, I like the way these sections required me to get used to doing so whilst also having to actually focus on the challenge at hand. In general, the way every single one of these missions was designed to reuse one of the original game's courses is incredibly impressive, I think, because for the most part they feel just as dynamic as New Super Mario Bros. U's challenges, which often do rely on brand new level segments. And in this way, in my eyes, this stuff might as well be Wonder's version of a hard mode. The challenges encourage you to replay a large number of the original game's levels in wacky and difficult ways, and that's all I wanted. In fact, speaking of stuff I wanted, I made a whole other video that's partially about how I don't like that the structure of the original game's Wonder effects lead to most players missing out on the sometimes quite interesting level segments that Wonder effects replace. But guess what? Quite a number of these new Toad Brigade training challenges take place in those sections. So whereas previously the game never gave players a reason to play through the Sugar Star level without being able to mow them down with the Starman Wonder effect, or this unique part of the level Flight of the Blooms, the inclusion of sections like those in this new side mode pretty much negate that issue, and I'm weirdly happy about that. Anyways, going back to stuff I mentioned in the predictions video, I also really wanted some kind of more traditional online multiplayer to be added, maybe by introducing game share support to the game. And although it's a bit janky in the way online modes in most Nintendo games are, that's exactly what happened. This was definitely a necessary addition when it comes to the new stuff added to the upgrade as a whole, since most of the Attraction Central minigames would have otherwise only been accessible in local multiplayer. Now, I definitely didn't predict that the biggest feature of Wonder Switch 2 DLC would be the addition of a bunch of Mario Party or Nintendo Land style minigames, and in fact, when this stuff was first revealed, I didn't really think it would interest me. I never saw the lack of side content like this in the original game as a problem, so therefore I'm surprised by just how much I like both the local and online attractions. Sure, some of them are hit or miss, this. The coin collection and Yoshi fruit eating minigames are a bit too samey, the KO arena mode is extremely forgettable, the puffy jump survival sections pale in comparison to the propeller platform versions, the online flapjet and propeller flower races are extremely shallow gameplay-wise, and it's a bit too easy to mindlessly catch players by spamming your attack during Phanto Tag. But most of the attractions feature really clever gimmicks that make them quite enjoyable in my opinion. It's really fun to take advantage of all the ways you can kill each other using the original game's mechanics in the Battle Royale mode. The Donut Block Maker attraction features some simple but satisfying puzzles. The counting minigames are as stressful as they are hilarious in large groups. Getting through the Captain Toad levels by trying to work with the other player's movement is kinda thrilling. Managing the surprisingly in-depth momentum tech of the roller skates elevates what could have otherwise been yet another boring race mode, and I love the design of the invisible block mazes, and how it's always feasible to make a last-minute comeback by taking advantage of the fact that players ahead of you have already revealed the upcoming blocks. Overall, one of my favorite choices that was made for many of these minigames is the inclusion of loads of randomized elements. At first glance, it might seem like most of the attractions take place in the exact same level environments every single time, but many courses feature some enemies or blocks or even entire segments that randomly get shuffled around every single round, which helps to keep things fresh. So yeah, even though I wasn't really looking forward to most of this stuff ahead of the upgrade's release, it's an aspect of Wonder Switch 2 Edition that I ended up enjoying as much as the rest of it. Though I think maybe the most impressive thing about this DLC to me is that even though I've now just about covered its 3 most noteworthy aspects, there is still so much for me to talk about. There's all the new combo badges, the flower power-up, all the stuff that can be found by exploring the Bellabel Park world map, not to mention the flower currency system and customization, including amiibo support, the wholesome recruit Poplin pictures, Rosalina and Luma, the Pikmin and pixel art Prince Florians, and the optional more zoomed out camera. I'll talk about some of those a bit more in depth later on, but the point I'm making here is that most of that stuff wasn't necessary. I tried to make my predictions about Wanda's potential Switch 2 upgrade quite conservative, because I'm used to Nintendo cutting corners when it comes to Mario DLC. For example, say what you want about New Super Luigi U or even Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's Booster Course Pass, but I feel like it's clear that both weren't as fully fleshed out or polished as the content they were added onto. So it really surprised me to discover that the Bellabel Park expansion feels as fully fledged and stuffed with fun little details as the original game, if not more so. Your mileage may vary as far as your enjoyment of the upgrade's main content goes, but I think overall this is the Switch 2 edition that's most worthy of its $20 price tag. Anyways, time to address the obvious pun in the room. See, my only Super Mario Bros. Wonder criticism video I haven't mentioned so far is the one where I go over my problems with the game's elephant transformation. Now, of course, the Switch 2 edition was never gonna rework the game's main power-up, and yet I do also feel like this issue has kind of been addressed in a roundabout way through the inclusion of the Super Flower Pot. My problem with the elephant transformation really boils down to something very subjective. Its eye-catching design and prevalence in the game's marketing made me think it would be a very versatile and transformative power-up that I would want to use as much as possible in the same vein as the cat suit. But instead it's focused on smaller overarching gameplay tweaks, and the lack of more impactful unique abilities makes it feel more like a higher tier super mushroom. So it's not necessarily a bad power-up on its own, but within the context of how it's integrated into the original game, to me it's definitely a disappointing one. And then there's the new Super Flower Pot power-up, which I suppose kinda feels like an attempt at a course correction. As I've mentioned before, something very unique about the original game is that it doesn't feature a single traditional flying power-up. But never mind all that, because the flower form comes with a powerful flutter jump that leads to a glide move, kind of like the acorn suit. In fact, given Yoshi doesn't appear in Super Mario Bros. Wonder as a power-up for whatever reason, applying his signature move to a different ability feels like a deliberate compromise. This, combined with the vertical flower projectile attack, means the flower suit is probably the most widely useful power-up in the entire game, because it greatly expands both the player's movement and combat abilities without featuring any downsides. In fact, because the flower form also allows the player to spray water, there is barely any reason to use the elephant transformation anymore. And I wonder if that influenced the decision to not retroactively integrate the Super Flower Pot into the original game's levels. The only way to actually play through the normal campaign with the new ability is to either take it with you from one of the new levels or use the badge you get for defeating all the Koopalings. And considering you can only do that after having played through most of the game's worlds, in a way, being able to use the flower suit to cheese the original level design kind of feels like a post-game reward, a lot like the power-up variations that appear in the post-games of Super Mario 3D Land and World, or the way the penguin and propeller suits are integrated into New Super Mario Bros. U. Though in terms of functionality, it's more reminiscent of the Super Crown in New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe. It's a power-up that was added to a game that wasn't originally designed around it, that features an extremely overpowered combination of abilities that render most of the game's other power-ups kinda useless. So in that light, one could argue that, just like the Super Crown, the Flower Pot is yet another type of easy mode. And therefore, I suppose it might not be such a bad thing that, unlike the Super Crown, the Flower Pot wasn't integrated into the original game's levels. Though this also means that it doesn't really have a significant impact on the way I feel about the game's power-up roster as a whole. A normal playthrough will still require the player to use the elephant transformation almost as much as before, and, well, you know my opinion on that thing by now. Speaking of stuff I don't like, the final Super Mario Bros. Wonder problem I want to talk about in this video is one that is actually new to the game's Switch 2 edition. See, this version of the game allows you to enable an option that zooms out the camera during the original game's levels. This is intended to make multiplayer more manageable, but it can also be turned on for single player. And I have mixed feelings about this addition. On the one hand, yes, having the camera be more zoomed out during multiplayer does make the mode less chaotic. And in general, it's incredibly impressive that the designers even bothered implementing this, given all of these levels weren't designed to work at this larger zoom level. But on the other hand, well, I think it's still very clear that that's the case. Not only does it feel kinda awkward that this zoomed out camera mostly reveals a bunch of dead space at the top and bottom of the screen, but in some cases the larger zoom kinda breaks the original level design in some subtle ways. Previously, the game featured a bunch of secrets that required the player to navigate areas that were just barely off-screen, but all of these parts are now visible from the start so long as the camera is set to the larger zoom. And then there are the visual compromises that were made because of this addition. The game features plenty of assets that were clearly designed to perfectly fit the original screen size that look kinda odd this way. And sometimes this inspired janky workarounds, like the background tiles that had to be placed here to ensure this icicles asset doesn't cut off. But the worst offender, in my opinion, is what happened to Light Switch Mansion. This level uses background assets that perfectly fit the default screen size, meaning with the larger zoom, they would have normally cut off at the top. So, in order to prevent that from happening, the developers spammed the top of the screen throughout almost the entire level with repetitive background walls. This is such an awkward solution. It's exactly the kind of thing I used to do when making my earliest custom New Super Mario Bros. U levels when I was a kid and didn't know any better. The developers could have easily made an extended Ghost House wall asset. In fact, I did that exact thing when I recently ran into this same issue whilst making one of my new custom levels, but instead now the entire level features this strange visual blemish, which by the way is also visible without the more zoomed out camera. I haven't had the time to replay the entire game at the larger zoom to find every example of a compromise like this, but I think the fact that this nice little quality of life option required ugly, janky solutions like this that even influence the default way of playing the game makes me wonder if this feature should have been included at all. Though I realize that most people who aren't as obsessed with this game as I am won't even notice or care about stuff like this, so maybe it's just a me problem. So, does the Switch 2 edition fix Super Mario Bros. Wonder? Well, saying it's possible for the game to be fixed implies that it was originally broken, which, despite my many nitpicky complaints, definitely isn't the case. Yes, I think in general the Switch 2 upgrade addresses most of the problems I had with the original game in one way or another, and the new problems it introduces are really quite minor by comparison. However, despite its impressively in-depth content, I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is by far the definitive version of Super Mario Bros. Wonder. The boss fights, missions, minigames, and other miscellaneous additions are neat, but the game's main levels and moment-to-moment gameplay are largely identical. So, like, if you don't own a Switch 2 and are watching this feeling salty about the fact that you don't have access to the new content, I wouldn't be too fussed about it. The Bellabel Park editions are mostly really great, but they do also feel like just a dessert compared to the meal that is the original game. As for what Bellabel Park will mean for this channel moving forward, well, despite what my April Fool's joke led some people to believe, modding any of the new content or porting it back to the original Switch 1 version isn't feasible at the moment and probably won't be for years to come. So I'll continue making custom levels, maybe even some that feature ideas inspired by gimmicks from the Switch 2 upgrade, but for the most part the new content won't have a very tangible effect on my creations. Anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about for this video. Sure, there are parts of the upgrade that I barely mentioned, but I only wanted to address the stuff that I felt like I had something unique to say about. If you want to share your feelings about the Switch 2 edition of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, or anything else really, be sure to do so by leaving a comment. While you're down there, maybe also consider leaving a like, subscribing, checking out my Discord server linked in the description, or signing up for a YouTube channel membership to support the channel and get early access to upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!